Okay, folks, thank you for joining. We are recording this event so that we can post later on our website so you can review or at a later time. This session is going to be led by Kevin Iwassa Madge. Kevin's our registered dietitian, strength and conditioning coach that works with canoe kayak at the Canadian Sport Institute, Ontario, with our OPSI program athletes, and he works with a number of different athletes, different sports as well. You might have seen Kevin at some of competitions last summer, as well as Kevin at our ski camp last winter, if you remember him learning how to ski. So Kevin's been around for a little bit. He is a tremendous resource, and he's really great at answering questions that you have. So don't be afraid to ask questions. I know that nutrition certainly was identified by a lot of our Ontario team athletes at needing support. So this is your time, and we'll provide opportunities in the future too, but make sure you're engaged as much as you can. And Kevin's sports background is wrestling, I believe. So any wrestlers out there, Kevin's your person. Thanks, Kevin.
All right. Yeah, so hey everyone. I won't introduce myself because Ryan did a good job there. But like I was saying again, this is meant to be interactive, so I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. I did try to integrate some software so that we can do some live interaction on the slides. So assuming that works, there will be opportunities for you to participate, and we encourage that. It's more effective, it's better for your learning, it's more enjoyable for me if you interact. So we strongly encourage you participating throughout and not just listening for an hour. So we're covering the foundations of nutrition for performance. So it's not nutrition for health, it is for performance, but we're really going to focus on some of those foundational pieces. You may have heard some of these things in the past, but the reality is often we need to cover this 5, 6, 7 times before it really translates into behavior change. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you know these things in your head. We want to see it actually translate into you doing something about it, improving your nutrition, and it actually helping your performance. So again, some of it might be seem a little repetitive, but as we go through, ask yourself if you've really changed your nutrition and improved your nutrition. And if the answer is no, then this is the time for us to review the basics and identify maybe why you haven't been able to make that change and problem solve. And hopefully, moving forward, we can create those shifts in behavior. All right. So the game plan today is we're going to cover kind of 4 pieces. So we're going to talk about how to eat, and that's going to really be that foundational piece. And then, but then we're going to talk about what this means in terms of like preparing, fueling, recovery, and some of that might be where it gets a little bit more open-ended and question-based along the way. But it's really going to be, again, that foundational piece, but then adding that sport element to it. So what does this look like leading into a training session? What does it look like maybe during a training session? What does it look like after a training session as well? So if this works correct, can you all see this with maybe if you're on mute, give me a thumbs up if you can see the link at the top of the screen. And if so, could you pull out your phone and actually type that link in? I'll type it into the chat as well. But if you can pull that up, because this is actually going to be how you interact. And if it works well, it will pop up right on the screen for everyone. It is anonymous, so you don't have to worry about typing something and everyone know it's you that typed it. So again, this is kind of this way that you can interact if you're a little bit on the shy side. And the link is also in the chat now. And once you're in, go ahead and answer that question. I know it's pretty broad, that's the point. But what does it mean to you? How does nutrition support performance? And quick double check just to make sure that it's working for everyone. Can everyone see a word on the screen now? Did that appear for you? Again, thumbs up if you can see it, thumbs down if you do not see anything on the screen still.
Got it.
Excellent. And after you've answered, take a look at the screen. The bigger the word is, the more people that are typing that in. And so you can start to see, maybe search for those little, I know it's hard to find sometimes because it's moving, but search for those little words in there. Maybe you'll realize that other people are using nutrition for something you haven't even thought of before. We're getting the common ones: fuel, energy, health, recovery, performance. What about injuries? Can nutrition make a difference in injury prevention, injury recovery? Related a little bit to health, but also maybe thinking about on the illness side, supporting your immune system, preventing nutrient deficiencies. All right, great. So hopefully that was kind of a fun little way for you to get you kind of just thinking about this stuff. We'll go through, I'm going to show you my list now. And so a little bit more concisely, not to say that that big, broad kind of a mind map isn't useful, but for me, it's things like nutrition provides energy for high performance training. It can increase the rate of recovery. It can help us optimize body weight. It can help prevent nutrient deficiencies. It can help prevent injuries and infections and illness, or speed up the recovery from injuries and illness. And then a big one that some of you are going to say, it doesn't matter, I'll eat whatever if you tell me to. But I do think it's really important for us to remember that sometimes it's about eating and nutrition is about enjoying good food. Because if you don't acknowledge your preferences, then it's gonna make it a lot harder. In a lot of situations, it's actually possible for you to both eat in a way that you prefer and you enjoy, as well as meet your needs. And when we find that sweet spot where you both enjoy it and it's providing the appropriate nutrition for performance, that's where it becomes really sustainable. That's where it becomes something that you can do for the rest of your career. And if you're still battling with it, that's okay, but it just takes exploration. And sometimes it takes working with someone. So it's not a bad thing, but that's what we're striving for. We're striving to find something nutritionally that you can do indefinitely. If it feels like a real chore, you're not going to be able to do it forever. So try to think about that preference and enjoyment piece throughout as well. All right, so how do we eat for training then? So this is really Nutrition 101. We can talk about all of these things about what it does and what it means to us, but the reality is that we need to know what good nutrition is before we can start making these decisions. And so this is something we call a Nutrition Foundations Pyramid. And you might have seen a version of this before, but I really think this is a nice place to start because we often get this backwards. And often we'll start at the top and we'll try to build this foundation off of this tiny little piece at the top, when the reality is the foundation of nutrition, it's not sports drinks, sports gels, pre-workouts, supplements. It's none of that. It's eating real food, and it's eating real food multiple times a day. And it's learning how to cook and prepare real food, and it's eating your vegetables, and it's not always eating a meal that's either you're buying out of a fast food restaurant, or it's not always pulling it out of the freezer. It's eating real whole foods. And so that's really where you're going to build your foundation. You're going to get the most out of all of this. Creatine sounds cool, but the reality is it is a tiny boost in performance, if any. And the only way you can even harness that little boost in performance is if it's layered on top of a really good diet. And I see it all the time where people want to, get into pre-workouts, or they ask me if they should use a caffeine pill, or they, they ask what my thoughts are on a multivitamin or what the best protein powder is. But none of those really matter if you're not eating real food on a regular basis. And that's the reality of it. So, a lot of you might have questions, and I get it quite often after I talk about how whole foods are really important. I still get questions at the end about, what protein powder would you recommend? And I don't want to discourage you from asking questions, but my answer to that is when people say, what protein powder would you recommend? It's usually that you should eat some chicken or something like that. Like, that's the best way to get your protein is from food. So it's not to say that there's never a place for those sports supplements or sports foods, that there's never a place to use some Gatorade or eat a Cliff Bar or an energy gel, but that has to come on top of this foundation. So again, just to reemphasize, you need to be eating real food on a regular basis. And from there, we can supplement it with things like sports foods or some of those ergogenic aids. We can start looking into sodium bicarbonate and caffeine and creatine and beta alanine and some of these nutrients where you can get that little boost of performance, but it's only when it's layered on top of everything else. So this is the way I'd like you to approach it. And then the purpose of today is we're really going to try to take care of that basic piece at the bottom, and then maybe just touch into those sports foods, or just dip into the idea of sport nutrition and how we actually do this for performance, but it's taking care of that foundational piece. And so what then are whole foods? Why are whole foods really important? It's because they provide all of the basic nutrients. So whole foods provide us with good nutrition. And so we'll start here with our macronutrients. And you might maybe heard the term macronutrients before. Maybe you haven't, but you've probably heard of the macronutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, fats. And so part of it is understanding why these are important. Why are these nutrients called macronutrients? What do they do for us? And when should you be choosing to consume these macronutrients? And so we'll start there. And so carbohydrate then becomes our quick source of energy. So it's going to be the actual fuel to get you through training. And so if you think back to that mind map we created, fuel and energy were two of those big words on everyone's mind. And it's really about carbohydrates. And down the road, we could get into a debate about things like low carb, high fat, or ketogenic diets, or people talk about like fat adapted metabolisms. And again, maybe or maybe not, there are really isolated cases for that. But the reality is athletes need carbohydrates to get through training. And so again, carbohydrates become our energy for training. Protein's another nutrient, another macronutrient, and its primary purpose. Now it can provide a little bit of energy, and there are things in our body, like certain parts of our immune system, for example, are made of proteins. Our skin has a component of protein. So there are other things in the body, but when it comes to an athlete and sport performance, the role of protein is really about helping our muscles recover. So while we think about carbohydrates, we want to be thinking about energy, fueling, preparing us for training. Protein then becomes that recovery piece. It becomes after we've trained, how do we recover? How do we regenerate? How do we adapt and get better and stronger and faster and get ready for the next session, the next competition, the next race? So that's what we think of when we think of protein. And then to round out our macronutrients, fat is also an essential nutrient that we use for different organs within the body, our brain, our eyes, things like that. They have a fat component. Cholesterol is fat-based. Some of our vitamins are fat-soluble vitamins. So it serves all these other functions, but a key piece along with carbs and protein, these three macronutrients, they will provide us with calories. And fat is actually the macronutrient that has the most calories. So it may not be the best for fueling us quickly for training, but it can provide us with energy across the day when we think of that foundational piece again. So carbs, proteins, and fats, they all provide us with energy, although the carbs are really the one, again, that provides us with energy for training, because you don't want to go slow. The purpose is to go fast, and carbs are the only nutrient that can do it fast. And then to round it out is water. And we'll probably talk about water on another day, but I'm sure we all know that hydration is important. So carbs, protein, fats, these are really the key nutrients we're thinking of when we're talking about nutritional foundation or whole foods. And this is going to be how we start to create these decisions of what foods to select. So question for all of you then, because we haven't gone through this, but if we know that carbohydrates are important for fueling our training, then the natural question is, what are some of our carbohydrate foods? And so on your phone, I'd like you to give us an answer. And again, this is anonymous, so just take a shot at it. Don't be nervous if you get it wrong. That's okay. That's why we're here to learn. So we're seeing a good little distribution there. Yeah, and so in this case, the answer is bread, chocolate milk, and grapes. So a little bit more of a complete picture, but I like those little quizzes because it keeps it fun, but it also lets us get a sense if we're all on the same page or not without embarrassing anybody. Our sources of carbohydrates, starches are going to be a big one, and they're going to be probably the primary one you're aiming for in a lot of cases. And so these are things like our breads, our pastas, our grains, rice, cereals, granola bars. A few that people don't always think of, but some of our starchy vegetables, so things like potatoes, will have carbs. And then also some of our pulses, legumes, and so things like kidney beans, black beans, chickpeas, lentils, they'll also have some carbohydrates in them. So those are all great sources of kind of starchy carbohydrates. But fruits are another big one. So that can either be fruit or our fruit juices. They're going to be good sources of carbs. Certain dairy products. And so something like milk will have a little bit, but then something like chocolate milk will have more. Yogurt will have a little bit of carbs, but a flavored yogurt will have more carbs in it. And so that's often what we call added sugars. And so again, added sugars are important. Now, it's not to say that we want to always be using added sugar as a fuel source, but it's good to be aware because it is carbohydrates. And often what the goal is, it's to limit the added sugar and start to over across the day, shift as much of these carbohydrates to things like starches and fruits and maybe these dairies, because even though they have added sugar, they come with other nutrients as well. So we don't want to necessarily be eating muffins all day, and this isn't an excuse to do that. But being aware that we can get carbohydrates from our added sugars, as well as our fruits, our dairies, and our starches. So all different ways to get your carbohydrates. And what I would say is a good goal to begin with is to get the carbohydrates you need, get them at each meal, get them leading into training sessions so you're adequately fueled. Don't worry so much about the source. And when you feel like you can consistently do that, the next step would be, now let's make the quality higher. Let's actually choose the right sources instead of eating a donut before training. Maybe it's that we shift that to eating a banana before training. So, but start with just big picture, get some carbohydrates before training, get some carbohydrates at your meals. And that's a really good start. That's the foundation piece. So again, these are our sources of carbohydrates. All right, another question.
Can I ask you a question in person?
Yeah.
Okay, if you're on the go, what would be the quickest and the most efficient, let's say in a 20, 30-minute range time frame before the workout?
Yeah, so you probably want to stick with your carbohydrates. Again, we haven't gotten too much into fueling and digestion. That's probably a topic for another day, but it's a good question because it is important. We can just only cover so much. Carbohydrates, there are quick energies. That's partly because they digest the quickest. So you're going to want to grab a carbohydrate food that actually doesn't have a lot of protein and doesn't have a lot of fat in it because they take longer to digest. So something like a donut, it's got a lot of sugar, it's got the carbohydrates, but it's also got like a butter and a lot of like fats and stuff, right? So it might sit in the stomach not great, but something like banana is basically just carbohydrates. So that's good. I really like those applesauce pouches. You don't even need a spoon or anything. They're really good on the go. You just grab a couple pouches. You can squeeze them into your mouth. You don't need to worry about, they're like sanitary because so you don't have to worry about washing your hands before you touch food. Because you're not actually touching anything that's going in your mouth. So I find things like that are really nice on the go types of foods. But again, you want to focus on the carbohydrate ones as much as possible. Good question.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah. All right. So it looks like we got some bunch of answers. Most of them are pretty good in there. Just quickly why A and D are not correct. Bread's not going to have a lot of protein. Quinoa doesn't have a ton either. It has a little bit, but not actually as much as people hear about quinoa and they think it's a protein. It's got a little bit, maybe like 5-6 grams in a cup. It's not as much as people think. And then the reason why D is incorrect, the same thing for rice. Rice has some, if you have a whole grain rice, then you might have a little bit more, but you're talking like 5-6 grams, where a piece of salmon might have like 25 grams. So there's a little bit in there, but they're really not the magnitude that we're looking for. Where'd my cursor go? So yeah, good job. So when it comes to protein foods, here's the list. So we've got our meats. This is actually a little old school now. Canada's Food Guide's breaking it up differently these days, but I'm not a huge fan of the new Canada's Food Guide, to be honest. That's a topic for another day, though. Meats and our alternatives. And the reason why I like to break it out that way is kind of what I was just talking about. Yeah, you can have plant-based sources of protein. And it's not to say you shouldn't, because they're good sources of other nutrients. Nuts are good sources of healthy fats, hint, hint, for later. Beans, we talked about earlier, a good source of starches and carbohydrates. But they just don't have as much protein. If you take 3 ounces of chicken, that's going to have like 25 grams of protein, which is like the perfect amount for a meal or a snack. If you have a whole cup of beans, like kidney beans, you might only get 15 grams. If you have even milk and eggs, we talk about are pretty good sources, but if you have a cup of milk, that's only about 8 grams. One egg has only about 6 grams of protein. So you'd need to have like 3 or 4. A tablespoon of peanut butter has maybe like 4 grams. So you're talking about you need to have like 6 tablespoons to get the amount you would get from a piece of chicken. There's just not as much protein in there. So it's not to say that they aren't good sources, but it really goes back to our meats being the main source in a lot of our diets to get adequate protein. If you are someone who doesn't like to consume meat for whatever reason, that's fine. But what it means is you need to take extra care to make sure you're getting all of that protein from other sources. So again, this isn't to kind of push away from veganism or plant-based diets. It's more about an awareness. And that's why I like to separate these out into the meats and the alternatives, because the meats just have so much more protein. it makes it that much easier for us to reach our goals. It's like having a head start. So those are sources of protein. Again, it's the meats, some other animal-based foods that aren't meats, things like eggs and dairy, milk, cheese, and then some of our plant-based sources, it's going to be those pulses, beans, nuts, seeds, things like that. All right, another question. And feel free again to type a question or unmute yourself and ask a question back to me while we're filling this out.
May I ask you a question again, Kevin?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. What do you think is the balance for the minerals in your system? Not necessarily mostly salt, like the traditional salt, but other minerals that we can bring to the table in order to participate in our athletic outcome.
Yeah, good question. So I'd say that minerals, it depends on the mineral. But if we break it into things like our electrolytes, like the salt you just talked about, potassium, magnesium, calcium, these are some ones that we're going to lose in our sweat. And so they need to be replaced. And that will actually come in a little bit. We're going to address that. So we'll talk about what foods you can get those from. Yeah, so I'd say those for athletes, you're sweating a lot, so it's something that you need to kind of constantly be aware of and replacing in your system. And then we can kind of think of more of the other types that maybe take a little longer. So something like iron, you don't lose, it doesn't fluctuate a lot on a daily basis, but that might be something we'd want to monitor in the blood because some people get low and then we want to supplement it. But those are things that kind of vitamin D, it's a vitamin, not a mineral, but it takes a long time. It'll go up, it will build it up over the summer, and then it will drop in the winter. So in the winter, we might supplement it. So those are some of the areas where we might look long-term, layer on some supplementation. But that's again on top of that foundational piece. But in terms of the electrolytes, we'll cover that later. So hold your thought on that. But that's a good question. All right. So here's this one. Good job, most people. I would say the reason why C is not correct is that butter and mayonnaise, they're probably, I wouldn't say anti-inflammatory. So it's really this source. They are sources of fat, but just not the necessarily the anti-inflammatory kinds. So then that naturally leads us to, well, what are anti-inflammatory fats? And this part's interesting because it's almost a contrast to what I was saying about protein. And it's our healthy fats or our anti-inflammatory fats. These almost exclusively come from our plant-based sources. Now, the exception would be something like fish oil. Where again, it's just kind of like an exception to the rule, but mostly it's coming from plant-based sources. So earlier when I was talking about protein, a lot of times we want to aim for our meats and our animal-based products. They're an easier way to get our protein up. When it comes to fats, it's the flip side. And so this is why I like to usually recommend balanced diets where it's not a lot of animal-based products or a lot of plant-based products, because it kind of just depends on the nutrient we're looking at. If we're talking about protein, people are going to say, oh, look, this is why animal-based products are good. And then when we're talking about fat, people are going to say, this is why plant-based products are good. And so the reality is probably you should have a mix of both, unless you have strong feelings as why you would want to go one way or the other, maybe for ethical reasons. So again, our anti-inflammatory options, they are mostly are plant-based, but then with fish thrown in there. And I can see a couple of you are talking in the background. And so maybe it's just a little distracting. So if you could try to pay attention, unless you're planning on asking a question and you don't realize that, that you're muted. And then the flip side of that would be our pro-inflammatory fats. And so these are going to be more of our animal-based products, butter, fats from meat, bacon, and also our processed food. So we talked about with our donuts, fried French fries, pizza, that you don't think are healthy are probably the sources of these pro-inflammatory fats. All right, next question.
Okay, I got a question again. Sorry about that, Kevin. So let's say you're craving some foods,
Yeah,
right?
no, don't apologize.
Bad
Keeping
food,
it interesting.
bad foods that are really bad for you as an athlete. How do you compensate that? I'm not meaning like just a cheat day, or how you compensate to get back in the rhythm.
Sorry, I think I missed some of your question there. I didn't actually hear much of it. I kind of lost everyone for a second. So I just heard you say you're craving some foods, and then that was it.
Yeah, you're craving some foods, you give in and you eat what you're not supposed to, and then you want to get back in the rhythm.
Yeah, I would say it really comes down to preparation. And so when you do find yourself in those, well, one, limit the amount, the how many times you end up where you're really craving food. And you do that by not getting really hungry, to snacking on a regular basis, actually have adequate fueling, adequate recovery in the first place. You won't find yourself in that situation as much. But when you do, have your kind of go-to things prepared. So maybe if you know you get cravings for sweet things, maybe you always have some like flavored Greek yogurt with fruit in the fridge so that you could go and have that. Maybe that helps satisfy. So it looks a little different for everyone, but it's about being prepared or knowing. Some people find that if they have like a kind of like a mindfulness check-in every day, that if they do kind of spiral out of control a little bit, if they know like every day at 6, maybe it's a reminder that pops up on their phone, they can they see it, it's like kind of a moment to like settle themselves and realize like, how am I doing today? Have I been totally off the mark? Should I like, go to my backup plan, which is like go to the fridge, grab my Greek yogurt with some fruit or something in it. So it's a little different for everyone, but I think it comes down to being prepared. And if you know yourself as you learn yourself and you can come up with plans, the less likely you are to kind of spiral too far out of control in terms of following your nutrition plan, the easier it is to get back on track. Good question. Again, that we could do a whole presentation on stuff like that, right? So, but that's kind of the general basis of it. In terms of this, the answer is all of the above. And so sources of water, sometimes we make it more complicated than it needs to be, but sometimes we also want to be aware of all of our options. And so obviously water is an option. It's our main option, but we also want to be aware that we can actually get fluids from other sources. So when we start talking about how you should be having maybe 2, 3, 4, whatever number of liters a day, and you're saying, Kevin, I just can't drink that much water. That's okay. You don't necessarily need to drink that much water. And this is where you want to start to understand what are your other options, because it goes back to the enjoyment. If you can enjoy it, if it's not like a big hassle to do, then this is something we will be able to do more consistently. And hydration is one of those ones we have to stay on top of. It doesn't take long. It's not like
You're frozen.
Kevin, we lost you there. Okay, bear hold in group. I'll see if Kevin's gonna come back on.
All right, can everyone see that again? Am I back?
You're back, Kevin. We can't see anything though.
Can't see anything yet. Can you see that now?
Yes, that's good. Thank you. We're back on.
All right. Yeah, sorry about that. So what I was saying is that you need to find the fluids that you enjoy, and then you need to just be consistent about it. So you don't have to make it more difficult on yourself than it needs to be, but you do need to stay on top of your hydration. And so it's knowing that water is, but also our tea and coffee. Now it has some caffeine and that can be a bit of a diuretic, but usually once people consume caffeine regularly for a few days, it stops really having any impact on our fluid output. And so it can actually be a source of hydration. Now, if you've never drank coffee before, I wouldn't recommend drinking coffee for the first time at a national championships. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if it's part of your regular routine, then that tea and coffee can also be a part of it. Our dairies, juices and smoothies, fruits and vegetables, soups and stews. This can be a really good one when it's really cold. Sometimes we don't drink a lot of fluids when it's cold. We don't really feel the same effects of dehydration, or we don't feel as thirsty. But again, soups and stews, they can be hot. That can be a good way to get fluids in if you know that you're not drinking enough at certain times. And then again, not the best option in certain situations, but knowing that any of our pops and our sports drinks or anything like that could also be sources of fluids. So knowing all of your options, again, just like the sugars are still carbohydrates, whether they're good or bad for us, that's the starting point. And then as you get more comfortable with it, you start shifting to maybe the more, the healthier, the higher quality options. All right, another question.
I'll go with B at this one.
Yeah, so the answer here is our grains and starches. And so I'll answer this question, and then we'll get into why these are some of our answers. Try to put it all together. Now that we start to know what our nutrients are, but we haven't talked about vegetables a whole lot. Yeah, so we're getting energy. They have lots of carbs. So what's actually interesting is a lot of our vegetables, they actually don't have a lot of carbs. and they actually don't have a lot of calories, which is our energy. So they're not exactly what people think, but I'm seeing good things like micronutrients, hydration. They were just talking about that, necessary nutrients, minerals, micronutrients. So we're on the right track. Vitamins would also be, there you go. Vitamins is another. So Stefan, this goes back to your question a little bit, right? Is that those nutrients, like our minerals, our vitamins, we got to stay on top of our vegetables so we don't end up with these deficiencies. Because sometimes they take a while. Sometimes it doesn't occur right away. It can be a bit of a time bomb where someone's not eating right, but we don't realize it till 6 months down the road. Right. And at that point, if you takes that long to create, sometimes it takes that long or longer to fix. So we don't want that occurring. So that's partly why. And then the other big one, yeah, I like seeing some of these answers, but the other big one is fiber. Which is technically a carbohydrate, but it's not a calorie-containing carbohydrate. It's not the type of carbohydrate that's going to provide us with energy. It has a totally different purpose. But fiber can be one of those other key nutrients. But then we're seeing things like builds character, mental toughness. That's good. I like that. So this is that heavy training plate we were referring to. And so you can see here, we've got all this stuff on the side. So yeah, you want to have your healthy fats and you want to have the flavor so it tastes good, and your milks and alternatives and your fruits and vegetables and drink lots of water and whatever. But what I want you to see here is that on a heavy training day, I want you to look at imagine the plates of pie graph. How have we split that pie graph up? Right? So it's about a quarter meats, protein foods, about a quarter vegetables, and then half of it is those grains and starches and carbohydrate foods. Now I want to show you what happens, and this is all on paper, obviously, so you still have to tweak this for yourself, but what becomes ideal for a moderate training day? So a day when we're not training quite as much. And take a look at the shift, what occurred there? Right, so we saw that decrease in carbohydrates and increase in vegetables. And if we take that to even more of an extreme, this is a light or maybe a recovery day, or maybe just like a really easy training day, maybe just one training session instead of two. You can see we go even lower on carb foods and higher on vegetables. So again, it's a pie graph, and we're shifting the proportions back and forth based on the type of training. And so just like you might have heard of terms like periodized training, where your coach sometimes gives you lots of volume and sometimes gives you lots of intensity, we want to match that with a periodized nutrition. And on days where we do a lot of training, we want lots of carbs. Remember, carbs are our energy. And so, yes, you need to figure out what foods to put on here. And so you need to figure where are my carb foods that I enjoy, what are carb foods, you need to know that. Then you need to put them on your plate and actually eat them. But the next step, this is the sport nutrition. You need to eat them in the right amounts at the right times on the right days. And so again, on a heavy training day, lots of training means lots of carbs. On a light training day, we're not going to need as much carbs. We don't have nothing. You have some, but you just don't need quite as much because you're not training as much. You don't need as much energy on that day. This is a great time to catch up on those vegetables. Like some of you said, this is a great time to build character, build that mental toughness. But really what it is this is a great day to catch up on our fiber, to load up on those vitamins and minerals that maybe we're not getting as much of on a heavy training day because you just don't have room, right? You want to focus on energy and calories and carbs. So then on that light training day, we're playing catch up on the vegetables. And then you have a moderate training day in between. And so it really just becomes more about the concept of going back and forth. Because some people, this still isn't enough. Some of you are probably looking at me and saying, Kevin, like I can eat 2 of those. Maybe you need to eat 2 of those plates. But instead of just having pasta, 4 plates of pasta, still have your protein, still have your vegetables, but just double it up if you need more. Have 2 plates. And on these days, you might say, Kevin, that's not enough. I need way more carbs than that. So even on the non-training day, that's fine, but you still want to catch up on your vegetables. So it's always balanced. We're always getting this nutrition foundation we talked about. We're getting all of our nutrients. We're eating whole foods. We're eating our vegetables. We're building mental toughness or whatever. But it has to be in the right proportions to match our training needs. And this is really the difference between the average person and what the average person eats is healthy. It's probably this. This is the New Canada's Food Guide. It basically is a plate that looks like this, but that doesn't work for athletes. So it's matching the nutrition throughout the week, day by day, to your training.
So is this one meal in the day, or is this something that we're trying to achieve at every meal, or like?
Ideally, every meal. Yeah. Now, breakfast is like one of those meals where people are like, I can't eat that many vegetables. I get it. Maybe you're having some like a fruit salad or something instead. It doesn't need to look exactly like this, but I would say probably at least lunch and dinner, you want to make it look like this. Now, if your lunch doesn't have to be on the dinner plate, maybe it's in a Tupperware container because you're at school, or maybe it's a sandwich and then you have like some carrot sticks on the side for your vegetables. So it's not always going to look like this, but yeah, you want to try to match every meal kind of close to this. And then your snacks, they go back to the carbs or energy, protein is recovery, right? So before training, if you're having a snack, have some carbs. After training, if you're having a snack, have some protein, right? Or it can be carb focused before and protein focused after. It doesn't need to be all, so you can still have some protein before, but if you have too much, it might affect your digestion. You don't want to eat like a 6-ounce steak 20 minutes before you get on the water. So you want to focus on carbs before, but then after training, you want to get that protein. When people say, oh, what protein powder should I have? So it doesn't need to be a protein powder. Pack a peanut butter sandwich, right? Get some protein after. So that's the snacking piece, but then the meals, this is where we get that foundation. This is where we eat our vegetables. This is where we get our fiber and our micronutrients. This is when it happens, but we need to match it to the type of training day. Yeah, it's a good question though. It's every meal probably looks like this. Any other questions about the meals here? All right, so maybe at this point then, that's all the content I have planned, but we have a little bit more time here still. I think we have time. Ryan, do we have time for a Q&A? If anyone has kind of more open-ended questions?
Yeah, we have up to 10 minutes if there are questions.
All right, yeah, so again, you can type them into the chat. I just have to find the chat, but you can type them into the chat. If you want to ask a question anonymously, you can type it onto the screen at that same link and it will pop up here, but I don't know who asked it. So that's a great way, again, if you're a little bit more shy, but then also if you just want to ask a question and unmute yourself, feel free to do that as well. It also doesn't need to necessarily be about the content today. If you just have a question, this is a great opportunity to ask it. Caffeine drinks, yeah. So I don't know that specific. Is Minter Energy the brand? I don't actually know that specific one details, but I would say caffeine's like that ergogenic aid up at the top of the pyramid. So if you feel like you've got your Monster Energy, yeah, yeah. So I would say that's like that ergogenic aid or supplement, or like treat like a pre-workout up at the top. So if you feel like you've got your nutrition dialed in, like you're getting balanced meals, you're eating your vegetables, heavy days you eat more carbs, light days you eat less carbs, and then you're like, you're topping up with those snacks like carbs for fueling, protein for recovery, that might be a place where you start looking to ergogenic aids like caffeine. So whether that's coming from an energy drink like a Monster or a Red Bull, or you're taking a caffeine, or you're just drinking a coffee, I think that becomes preference at that point. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Do remember though that Monsters and those energy drinks a lot of them are carbonated. So sometimes that sits bad in people's stomachs. But yeah, again, I would say not necessarily a bad thing, but not instead of proper nutrition. So if you're having these, like I get athletes that are like, I had an athlete the other day asked him how his nutrition was. And he's like, oh, it's going really well. I had a Red Bull before I came here. Like, that's not going really well. You need to eat food, and then maybe you top it up with a Red Bull, maybe. Hopefully that answered your question. But caffeine is an ergogenic aid. There is evidence that it does improve performance, just a tiny bit though. All right, what are some of these other questions? You were talking earlier about fats and get omega-3s for people with seafood allergies who can't eat fish or fish products. Yeah, so a lot of the nuts and seeds, it won't be as good a source of omega-3s, but things like flaxseed can also be a good source of omega-3s. So that I would say a lot of people go like ground flax in smoothies and in their cereal, in their oatmeal, that kind of stuff. That's another good way to get it. I saw a YouTube video where a dietitian's page where she mentioned that potassium can help to reduce the amount of salt that your body takes up. So like if you ate a large McDonald's fries, you could also eat like 2 bananas and you'd be fine. Yeah, I don't think that you'd be fine. I think the damage is done. Now, it's not to say that, you know, I've never eaten a large McDonald's fries and I'm still here and I'm still alive, but there's no magic bullets. And so, yeah, like, you know, potassium and sodium work as a balance. So in theory, you might excrete a little bit more of the sodium, but I would say the sodium is really not the problem when you eat a large McDonald's fries. It's that you just ate a large McDonald's fries, right? You just ate deep fried potato. That's probably the problem with it. So again, you know, not the end of the world. I'm not a big fan of like, you know, bad foods and good foods and whatever. I eat fries too, but the damage is done. I don't think you can banana your way out of it. Sorry.
Kevin, we have 2 questions on the question side.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm just reading through the chat here. Okay, what would you recommend for a light breakfast before practice? Yeah, so I would say if it's like before a morning practice, you don't want to wake up at like 5 a.m. to make yourself a big meal and have time to digest it. I'd go for the carbohydrate foods, right? So that's, you know, fruit, bananas, muffins, apple sauces, toast, jam on it, bagel, something like that. Because that's going to digest the quickest. And again, doesn't take a long time to prepare. So, you know, assuming you don't want to wake up super early, I would just say go with the carbohydrate foods. And then that again becomes more of a snack, like not a meal, right? So when you're thinking about these balanced meals, make sure you really have a good lunch and good dinner, knowing you kind of skipped some of the those nutrients at breakfast. Yeah, it's a good question. Is there a major difference between fruit and vegetables? Yeah, fruit would be a source of carbohydrate. Most vegetables are not. There are some exceptions, again, things like potatoes and corn, but those are the exceptions. But if you're talking about spinach, broccoli, they won't have a lot of carbohydrates. They'll be good for fiber. They'll be good for vitamins and minerals, micronutrients, but fruit's going to have carbohydrates. Vegetables won't. Is carbs the best thing to have in between races? Yeah, I would say.
Kevin, sorry to interrupt. I think this actually is a great question when it applies to training and competition. You know, if we only have that hour and a half to, you know, 60 minutes to 90 minutes between, whether it's training session or a race, what's the best scenario there?
Yeah, so anytime you're short on time, it's carbohydrates. Whether that's you just woke up and you're getting out to training, you're in between races, it's a double day, you're in training camp, you're going from the gym to the water or the water to the gym. Anytime you're short on time, it's carbohydrates and it's being prepared, right? It's not finishing and then trying to figure out what you're going to have. It's having that granola bar and that piece of fruit sitting in your bag. It's having something waiting there. And then the more time you get, the more you can get into these other nutrients like proteins, fats, things like that. So if you have time to digest it, but when you're short on time, when you're just trying to get through a day of racing or training camp, it's carbohydrate food. So you need to have your list of carbohydrate foods. You need to know what they are. You need to be prepared. You need to buy them ahead of time. You need to have them in your bag.
Okay, is there any other questions for Kevin?
I know there's a fair bit in the chat that I haven't gotten to.
One of the questions, yes, Yeah, Kevin's presentation will be available. We'll put it on our website on the webinar series page next week, so everyone can see that. The other question, Kevin, and this leads into what we want to go from here, is a lot of responses I had was the struggle, especially right now, of preparing foods. A lot of the athletes are scrambling through their exams even this weekend, so just the time aspect to do that. Kevin actually will be preparing kind of a little library series of food preparation. I don't want to speak out of turn there, Kevin, but maybe you could talk about that a little bit, what we plan for the next couple of months.
Yeah, so we're still kind of ironing out the details, but what we'd like to do is create a bit of like an education curriculum, and so it can cover some of the foundational stuff we talked about today. We can, I think, from a knowledge point of view, next steps are probably getting to like the digestion and fueling rates, because we're getting questions about like, what do I do in between races? What do I do right before a morning practice? So we could do some content on that, recovery, hydration. But I think the other piece of that is some of those kind of food literacy skills and management skills. So it's, how do you go to the grocery store and pick up all your food really quickly, so you're not like running up and down the aisles over and over again looking for stuff. So planning that out. How do you prep foods really quickly? How do you chop vegetables without cutting yourself? How do you cook chicken without giving yourself food poisoning? So I think that there's also a place for those practical pieces that isn't rocket science, but sometimes people just don't know where to go with that and be prepared. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of planning ahead of time. And so we're going to try to create a kind of an education series that we can provide to you so that you can start to answer some of these questions.
Okay, folks, I think we'll end it there. If there are other questions, you can send it to me over the next 2 weeks, and I'll compile them, send it over to Kevin, and then have a way of getting that information back to you. But I really wanted to thank Kevin. I think this was Kevin's provided a number of presentations for us, and this was one of the best, I think, and I really enjoyed that periodizing your food based on your training. I think it's pretty simple, but I don't think we do it enough. So thank you very much, Kevin. For those who are following along with the Ontario team, we're meeting tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. On a different link. Look on the emails I sent you, and that will be body weights with Chris Mihak. And then at 11, we're having Mel come on and talk about sleep and recovery. And nutrition and recovery were highlighted as two of the biggest areas that athletes wanted information. So I think this was really good with Kevin, and certainly Mel's tomorrow is going to be very good too. So